Bible never says the giants were tall. Read the verses that supposedly created them, and there are only 4. They do not give a height. They do not give a war or a name or a face. They barely give a sentence. And yet from those 4 broken lines came an entire race of giants that has stalked the human imagination for 2,000 years. The verses are in Genesis, in the chapters just before the flood. They say that the sons of God came to the daughters of men and had children by them. They call those children the Nephilim, and the mighty men of old, the men of renown. And then the text simply stops. It moves on to the flood, as though everyone already knew the rest, but the rest was never there. Tonight, we follow the strangest gap in the Bible. 4 verses that explain almost nothing, and the centuries of writers who built a world of giants to fill them. Here is the thesis, and it overturns the way most people read these lines. We tend to assume the Bible contains the story of the giants, that somewhere in Genesis there is an account of who they were, how big they were, and what they did. There is not. What Genesis contains is a fragment. 4 verses dropped into the text without setup and without explanation, and then abandoned. So let us actually look at them. The text says that when humankind began to multiply on the earth, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and took wives from among them. It says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men and had children by them. And it calls those children the heroes of old, the men of renown. That is all. The word Nephilim appears and is never defined. We are not told who the sons of God are. We are not told how tall anyone is. We are not told what the Nephilim did or why they matter or what happened to them. The verses read like the torn corner of a page, the end of a story whose beginning has been ripped away. And that tear is the whole mystery. Because something in the ancient world clearly remembered the rest. The question is where the rest came from. So hold that gap open and watch what the centuries pour into it. Start with the word itself, because even the word is uncertain. Nephilim. We translate it almost reflexively as giants. But the Hebrew does not actually say giants. Scholars have argued for centuries over what the word means, and they still do not agree. One common idea links it to the Hebrew verb naphal, meaning to fall. On that reading, the Nephilim are the fallen ones, or the ones who fell, or even those who cause others to fall. Notice that this is about falling, not about height. The word may have nothing to do with size at all. So where did the giants come from? They came, in part, from a translation. Centuries before Christ, Jewish scholars in Egypt translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, in the version we call the Septuagint, and when those translators reached the word Nephilim, they rendered it with a Greek word, gigantes. The giants of Greek myth, the monstrous earth-born enemies of the gods. Feel what just happened there. A mysterious Hebrew word whose meaning was already unclear was poured into a Greek mold that came loaded with its own monsters. From that moment, to read these verses in Greek was to read about giants in the fullest mythological sense. The translation did not just carry the meaning across. It added one, and much of the Western world met the Nephilim for the first time already wearing the bodies of Greek titans. So before a single story is told about them, the giants are already half-made, made out of a doubtful word and a translator's choice. Keep that in mind, because the next layer is where they truly come alive. We have followed the Watchers before on another night. Now we return to that book for one reason: to watch it do the thing Genesis refused to do, to explain. First Enoch, written in the centuries before Christ, takes those 4 cryptic verses of Genesis and unfolds them into an enormous drama. Where Genesis says only that the sons of God took wives, Enoch says there were 200 of them, a class of angels it calls the Watchers, who swore an oath together and came down onto a mountain. And where Genesis names the Nephilim in a single breath and moves on, Enoch makes the giants the center of the catastrophe. In Enoch, the giants are enormous. They are devourers. They eat everything the people can grow, and when that is not enough, they begin to consume the people, and then one another. They fill the earth with violence and blood. This is the detail Genesis never gave. The height, the hunger, the horror, none of it is in the 4 verses. All of it is in the book that came after. And Enoch does something even more important. It answers the question of what the giants left behind. When the giants die, the book says, their bodies return to the earth, but their spirits cannot rest. Those spirits remain in the world as evil spirits roaming and afflicting the living until the end of time. So the giants are not only monsters, they are the origin of demons, a whole cosmology grown out of a fragment. This is the heart of the thesis. The giants we imagine are not the giants of Genesis. They are the giants of Enoch, and of the writers like him, projected back onto 4 verses that never described them. Here is the turn, and it reverses the order most people assume. It is natural to think the sequence ran one way, that Genesis told the story of the giants, and that later books like Enoch simply repeated and decorated it. The verse first, the legends after, the seed, and then the tree. But the evidence points the other way. Genesis 6 does not read like the source of a tradition. It reads like the survivor of one. The verses are too short, too abrupt, too unexplained to be the beginning of anything. They assume a story their audience already knew. They are not the seed. They are the stump, the cut-off remnant of a far older and fuller myth about divine beings, human women and their monstrous children, a myth that was once told at length and has been almost entirely pruned away. And that older myth did not die when Genesis trimmed it. It went on living outside the Bible, in the world of Second Temple Judaism, where writers were free to tell it in full. First Enoch told it. The Book of Jubilees, another retelling of Genesis from the same era, told it again, with the same watchers and the same devouring giants. These books were not adding to a complete biblical story. They were restoring a story the Bible had reduced to a fragment. So the verse did not create the giants. The verse is what was left after the giants were almost erased. And the tradition we inherited is not the Bible's expansion of Genesis 6. It is the Second Temple's reconstruction of what Genesis 6 had cut. There is one more thread inside the Bible itself, and it shows the giants quietly growing. Open the book of Numbers much later than Genesis, long after the flood. The Israelites send spies into the land of Canaan, and the spies come back afraid. They report a people of great size. And then they say something remarkable. They say they saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of the giants, and that next to them the spies felt like grasshoppers and seemed like grasshoppers in the giants' own eyes. Notice what this verse is doing. The Nephilim were supposed to belong to the world before the flood, the world that the flood washed away. Yet here they are again, generations later, walking in Canaan. The Bible itself is reaching back for that half-buried word and using it to explain the tall and frightening peoples of the land. The Nephilim have become a way to talk about giants among the living enemies of Israel. And here the height finally arrives plainly on the page. The grasshopper line is the moment the Nephilim become unmistakably enormous. Other passages join in, describing a people called the Anakim and a famous oversized bed belonging to a foreign king, kept as a marvel. The Bible is now actively building the giants it once only hinted at. The fragment in Genesis has begun to grow, even inside Scripture, into the towering figures we picture today. So the giants were assembled in stages. A doubtful word in Genesis. A Greek translation that read it as titans. A spy's report that made them tall. And a book outside the canon that gave them hunger and horror and a cosmic role. Layer upon layer, until the 4 bare verses were buried under a mountain of giants. And here we have to draw a hard line, because this is exactly the point where the real history gets hijacked. Everything we have followed so far is textual history. It is the study of how words change meaning, how translations add freight, how Second Temple writers expanded a fragment. It is about the growth of an idea inside human minds and human manuscripts. It is not, in any way, a claim that physical giants once walked the earth. That distinction matters because the Nephilim have been seized by a whole industry of pseudo-archaeology. You have likely seen it. Photographs of impossibly huge skeletons said to be unearthed and then covered up. Claims that ancient giants built the megaliths or that a secret history of a giant race is being hidden by museums. The images are fakes, often crude digital edits. The covered-up discoveries never happen. The supposed evidence dissolves the moment anyone checks it. None of that has anything to do with the actual story of the Nephilim. The real story is far stranger and far more human. It is the story of how a single damaged passage, a word no one could quite define, became a race of giants through translation, retelling, and imagination. The history is in the texts. The giant bones are not. And confusing the two does real harm to the genuinely fascinating thing that actually happened. So we hold to the texts. And the texts tell a story about people and the worlds they build out of a few broken lines. So consider what we have actually followed tonight. 4 verses in Genesis with no height, no war, and no explanation. A word, Nephilim, that may have meant the fallen ones and may have had nothing to do with size. A Greek translation that dressed that word in the bodies of titans. A book outside the Bible that gave the giants their hunger and their horror. And a later passage inside the Bible where frightened spies finally made them tall. The giants were not born in a single verse. They were grown across 1,000 years by translators and scribes and visionaries, each adding a layer to a fragment that had lost its own story. Genesis 6 was never the source. It was the survivor, the torn corner of an older myth, around which the whole tradition slowly rebuilt the giants. The verse itself had almost let go. And that leaves one quiet question hanging in the dark. Before the trimming, before the 4 verses, before Enoch came to fill the gap, there was an older story that someone chose to cut down to almost nothing. We can see its torn edges. We can feel its missing weight. But what did that first story say before it was made small? That we may never recover. And that is a story for another night.